Hi, folks.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen already?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks everyone for coming along today, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. I'm going to be sharing some insights that we have gathered from our wonderful parents who've taken part in our studies at the Blip Lab over the last few years, and hopefully help bring a perspective about bilingualism that you might not have come across before, that is really grounded in the experience of what it's like to be bilingual in Singapore. By chance, it happens to be Brain Awareness Week this week. So I'd like to start with the perspective that as babies' brains grow, they develop more complicated connections between all of their different neurons, and the context in which that brain growth occurs determines how the brain develops. And that's our kind of framing position for today's talk. Later on today, we'll be hearing from some of our neuroscience partners who are doing fantastic investigations into exactly how we can find out how the brain is adapting to different kinds of linguistic environments. The other perspective I'd like to share is what we know about brain development and language development around the world. And it's a sad reality that although current estimates suggest that half of children across the planet are growing up with at least 2 languages in their home and learning those languages effectively, almost 75% of the published literature includes only evidence about how this brain development and how this language development works for children speaking just one language. If we look at that on a world map, and this is a special map that's been inflated so that we can see area according to how many languages exist in a different region of the world, we can see that those countries that produce the most research, USA, Canada, UK, and the entire region of Europe, for example, are actually really underrepresenting the diversity of language experience for children around the world. And we can see that Singapore itself is positioned in a much more linguistically diverse region, and that forms the background for how children are learning in this multilingual context. If we look at Singapore census data, the census in 2010 told us that around 30% of Singaporeans used English as the main language in their household, but those other familiar mother tongue languages were still well represented in households across Singapore. There's been a very rapid shift, though, and each of these little people here in this visualization represents 1% of the people in Singapore at the time of the census. So this is the census from 2020, and we can see that that proportion of households that are reporting English as the main language at home has jumped to 48%. And this is a very sudden shift in the amount of households that are favoring English as the main language at home. But we might be interested, because we're all here to learn about multilingualism in children, we might be a little bit interested to find out what that might look like for the youngest Singaporeans. So I have here again the data from the 2010 census, where each of these rows now represents one 5-year age band. And the youngest Singaporeans at the very bottom of the chart are those 5 to 9-year-olds. And this was the first time in Singapore's history that the youngest Singaporeans, or any group of Singaporeans, was reported to hit the 50% mark for how many kids are using English as the main language at home. To return to the 2020 survey data, we can now see that the 50% mark has moved up to 30 to 34-year-olds. So again, we're seeing this rapid change in the adoption of English as the majority language in people's family environments. But there's good news alongside this in the newest census. The newest census lets us find out a little bit more about whether people are using other languages alongside that majority language. And now we can see that it's actually only a very small proportion of people across the full age spectrum. And indeed, for the very youngest Singaporeans as well, it's only a very small proportion of people in Singapore in 2020 who report that there is only one language being used at home. So if we look just at those youngest Singaporeans, and each of these little people symbols represents 1% of 5 to 9-year-olds in Singapore at the time of the last census, we can see that although 75% of households report that their 5 to 9-year-olds use English most of the time, if we look at those children from the perspective of what other languages they also use, we can see that only a small proportion of children are exposed to only one language, or are using only one language in their home environment. And that's only 13% who are using English only, and only around 15% overall. So this means that children in homes in Singapore are hearing a wide variety of mixes of language in their home environment. In some of our previous work, what we've done is catalogued from reports from parents of who speaks how much of which language when they're speaking with the baby. We've been able to quantify the kinds of input rates that families are using when they speak with their child in different languages. But this self-report metric has a few limitations. Obviously, people might think that they use their languages in certain ways, but that might not actually match how they use it day to day when they're communicating with their children. So in a series of research programs that we've been running over the last few years, we've been very interested in how parents use their different language resources together when they're communicating with their children, for example, in a storytelling context. So we developed a wordless picture book that you can see on the right here called What a Scary Storm. And it's a picture story that a parent can share with their child, where the illustrations tell the story, and they can use whichever language they like while they are narrating the story to their child. And they can even mix freely between their languages because there's no text on the page to kind of suggest or guide what language is most appropriate when. And this is a really great way of us learning more about what families like to do, or what families typically do when they're communicating with their children. Now, we began our program of narrative research during COVID, and some of you in the audience may indeed have taken part in our narrative storytelling over the platform Zoom. So what we were able to do was show the wordless picture book on the screen so that parents could sit together with their child and talk through the story as the pictures appeared on the screen. In those narrative retellings, we are able to record the conversations that parents have with their children, and I'll share just one example with you now.
Is it gray stones over there? The grandparents then runs and hides underneath and hack onto one of the blocks of the column. Aeroplane. Is it aeroplane? No, but it's elephant. Is it elephant? Next. What is that? Breathing. You're right. It's an elephant. He's hugging the leg of an elephant. An elephant says what?
So as you can see in this lovely example, parents can freely describe the pictures in whatever way they like. The children are free to join in with the storytelling, and we get all sorts of rich details about the kinds of words that parents are using together with their children and which languages they're using at that time. For families who took part in this study, another feature of the study was for us to build up a little language profile for each of the children involved. And we were able to share back with parents a report about how each member of a child's care team might be using their languages together with the child when they speak. And we can consolidate that into a summary of the child's total language exposure. So with these two tools, the Leo report, which helps us understand more about the way that a child might be hearing their language from all their different family members, and then a recording of a parent sharing a narrative story together with the child, we're able to gain lots and lots of unique insights into the relationship between children's language development and the way that families use their languages together. Behind the scenes, what we do with those narrative retellings is we have a team of research assistants who assist us to transcribe all of the details of the speech that was used with the children. And it's very important for us that all of our transcribers are locals who have lots of experience with the local language context. And almost all of our transcribers are multilingual. We can then take the evidence that we have collected from our parent populations and start counting up different properties of the speech to figure out how, in that real-time storytelling context, how parents are using their languages together. So I want to share one more example here of the kind of thing that turns up quite often. And this is the case of a parent who is using more than one language together in just one very short snippet of speech. Ooh. I'll play that one more time because I think the audio may not have been coming through correctly. Let's give it one more go. So this kind of behavior, using linguistic resources from many languages together in a free-flowing pattern, is known among speech scientists as translanguaging. Now, you may have heard the term code switching before, and for a lot of researchers in the field, we reserve the term code switching for when we use one language together and then perhaps make a switch to using a different language for a different context. Translanguaging, by contrast, is a more complicated and rich way of using languages together that involves mixing together in the same stream of speech resources from all of our different languages. This is a very sophisticated skill, and it's a kind of language use that people who only speak one language don't have access to. So it can sometimes seem like people might be mixing up their languages or making errors when they speak, but it's actually a very powerful tool for communicating in a multilingual context. So to sort of map this out, if we have a sentence like the one above, which is color-coded for words in different languages, one model of language use would be that each of these languages is discrete and separate, and the words belong only to one language. And a person will always know when they're speaking one language and when they make a conscious choice to switch to a different language. By contrast, the translanguaging model is a bit more like each of your languages is a different fruit in one combined fruit salad. You always know which piece of fruit you're eating at a time, but you might enjoy the experience of having a piece of strawberry and a piece of pineapple at the same time. So, what does it look like when we take our transcriptions and we apply these color-coded segments to them and look at the rich tapestry of parental speech together with their children in this storybook context? In the chart that I'm sharing with you now, we can see one row of data for each of the parental conversations that we recorded in our storybook study at the first time point. So we have around 140 families participating in the study at this time point. And we're showing the data from the youngest children at the very bottom and the oldest children at the very top. So the first thing that we can see is, on average, the conversations tend to get a little bit longer as the children get a little bit older. The other thing that we can see straight away is that most of our parents in this storybook context chose to use English most of the time, and that's why that blue color is predominant. But some of our families chose to use a different language. For example, some of our families chose to speak mostly in Mandarin or mostly in Malay or Tamil. I'm going to zoom in now so we can see in a little bit more detail what this tapestry looks like. So I'm zooming in just on the first minute of speech. And now we can see at this higher level of detail that lots of our families are using their linguistic resources together. So we can see that translanguaging pattern in many of the conversations of our parents. And I'll zoom in one more time so we can really get an impression of it. So I'll zoom in to this level of detail, and we can see that sometimes it's just one word at a time in a different language from the surrounding context. So we've started measuring what this behavior looks like. And one of the features that we have discovered is that on average, individual families will perform this kind of translanguaging behavior at different rates, but it seems quite typical for around 5% of a parent's conversational units to include this kind of mixing behavior. Some of our parents do this less, some of our parents do this not at all, and some of our parents do this almost in 50% of their utterances. And what we can take away from this is that using languages together is a completely normal behavior in the Singapore context, but that most of us do it only around 5% of the time. We can also look at whether this mixing behavior is changing other properties of the speech. So one of the properties of parental speech to children that we know is very important for their language development is the complexity of the speech in terms of the number of different words that are used by a parent. And what we see here is that some parents, when they're speaking just in English, use a wider range of words than when the same parent is using their other language, typically their mother tongue. Some parents show the opposite pattern. When they're using their mother tongue, they use a wider diversity of words than when they're speaking in English. But quite a lot of our parents are at the same level for both. So it seems that each parent's pattern of unique language skills might be contributing to the way that they incorporate diversity into their conversations with their children. Another feature that we've just started exploring is the complexity of speech when it comes to how many different units of meaning are in just one sentence or just one utterance spoken to the child. And in this chart, we have a subset of the children, and what we can see here is that complexity profile over the whole storybook session, separated out for whether or not the parent was speaking in just one language at a time, or whether the same parent had one of those translanguaging sentences. And what we see here is that the translanguaging sentences that contain speech from a variety of different languages actually turn out to be more complicated than the utterances for this subset of parents, than the utterances that are monolingual. We're very excited to dig into this detail in a little bit more depth in the coming months, and we're very excited to share back with the community when we've gotten to the bottom of this story. So we have one more detail that is our ability to pick out those special words that we refer to as red dot words, the words like cho cho and zit zit, that don't really seem to belong to one language more than another, but might be unique to the Singapore context. Now, these red dot words also include words like la, le, lo, but we know that they're very special in communication with children. So when we take a look at whether those little red dot words are contributing to the complexity of speech, on the whole, we do indeed see that when parents are using those words together with other linguistic utterances, once again, parents are using more complicated utterances with their children, which is excellent for forming those brain connections we talked about earlier. So we're learning a lot about the way that families use their languages together with their children, and we're excited to share back with our community more as we discover more of these details. And on that note, I'd like to give a big thank you to our multilingual team here at Blip Lab, who've been working hard at staying in touch with our parent community and hopefully inviting you to take part in our next round of studies as well. So thank you very much for your attention today.